the SSC's developments with the early days of Fermilab. Over the next few years, as site proposals were being prepared for several states around the country, I realized that the SSC might not be simply added to Fermilab, which seemed to me to be the logical choice. And as it turned out, this was what had happened with Berkeley in 1966 when the Illinois site was selected for Fermilab. A decision to make a new laboratory was made. So I realized that the decision-making process was becoming very political, and I learned a lot from all of this. In 1988, when the SSC was awarded to Texas, it was a shock for everyone at Fermilab. We watched and waited to see if everything would come together, but so many things kept going wrong. And it didn't help when Congress and the Department of Energy couldn't agree on budgets and funding. So when Congress canceled the SSC in October 1993, the community of high-energy physicists around the world was stunned. To me, it seemed like the perfect storm was happening, that everything that could go wrong had gone wrong. And it affected everyone, not just the physicists in Texas, but of course they were most horribly affected. And things that had worked for the creation of Fermilab didn't work at the SSC. And this had turned, for me, from the best of times into the worst of times. An old friend, B.J. Bjorkane, who many of you will remember from Fermilab, has told us that the SSC was like Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express. He said they all did it. And our book tells most of the story. My hope is that tunnel visions will remind us, the survivors, and inform the next generation of the pitfalls to avoid next time. I do think CERN has already learned from some of our mistakes with regard to the Large Hadron Collider. Now, I want to say that we three authors, Lillian Hoddeson and Michael Reardon and myself, could not have completed this book without the help of many of you here tonight. Thank you for your courage and your cooperation with helping us tell the tale. I want to also thank my family for their love and patience with this effort over the last 30 years. And I'd really like to thank Sandmeyers for hosting us this evening. Where's Ulrich? Ellen? There you are. Ellen and Ulrich extended their hospitality for this book signing to me, as they do for many other authors here in Printers Row. So if there are a few questions, either I can attempt to answer or point you to someone who can give you an even better answer. And by the way, I also have the top 10 plus reasons for the collapse of the SSC that we know about so far. There may be more that we have yet to learn. And I can read you those, or we can just, okay.
Yes, please.
Read them, read them.
Okay. Start with 10, of
Is
course.
this like David learned?
Yeah,
with
but
number
it's
10.
not in that great of an order.
Bardine's fault, leave that out.
We have so many heroes of the SSC effort here, and I'm so appreciative for you to be here. Joe
Mark.
Locke worked with the state of Illinois. Ed Temple worked with the Department of Energy. Bruce Chrisman in the back worked with the laboratory and with the URA to try to make everything work right. People dedicated years of their lives to trying to launch this expedition into the frontier of physics. I always go to that metaphor. But it had to be a terrible, terrible disappointment when it all fell apart. So I'll give you a few ideas of some of the things that we considered led to the collapse. There was this perception as the costs grew that the cost was spiraling out of control. And, it had started out at $4 billion in the early 80s. And as you refine a design, the costs go up. As the time stretches out, the costs go up. So there was the perception that the cost for the entire project was just totally out of control in Washington, not in the scientific community so much. But in Washington, perception is reality, and so this is an important lesson for us. Ed, you can probably speak to this. There was also the perception that the Department of Energy was micromanaging the project down in Texas as it was under construction, and designs were continuing to be worked on. Number 3, the DOE's decision to run a basic research program as they might have run a military-industrial project. And these things get very complicated when you think about pure science and the Defense Department's contracts. And there are big differences, things that I knew nothing about when we moved to Fermilab. The Central Design Group's decision of 4-centimeter magnet was a burden on the project when they needed to change the size of the magnets, and this involved, unfortunately, a big cost increase. And these are not, it was not a good time to consider a more expensive scientific project. The Central Design Group and the physics community could have lowballed the cost estimate. Some people say yes, some people say no. They were convinced with their estimates in the early days at the Central Design Group, and then the project was accepted with those numbers in mind, and then things changed when the magnet had to be increased, and therefore the cost. So some people say the size of the project was too big, and so consequently the cost was too big. A big problem was that in creating a new laboratory on a greenfield site, to the extent that Waxahachie was green, Waxahachie, Texas, come on in, hi, was an issue because the new facility might have been added on to Fermilab. Some people even thought it might have been added to Brookhaven, and you wouldn't have had to create all of the infrastructure of a brand new laboratory. Then as the project got into trouble, there was a possibility of downsizing the SSC, but the physicists wanted to continue with the original scope of the accelerator. Another big problem, or should I say another problem, was the choice of the laboratory director. This is very controversial, and you'll read all about it in the book. There was inconsistent project management in the superconducting super collider from the very beginning, and this is a problem that is necessary when you have a project in the billions of dollars relying on congressional approval every year. Since World War II, big physics had been funded with the Cold War rationale, but after 1988, when the site for the SSC was selected, there was no more Cold War. Another argument was that Congress was short-sighted and dominated by deficit hawks. You know, these are all big issues of changing periods in Congress, changing times, national priorities. I try to look at the whole picture, and some people will say, you don't have to do that, it's just a science project, just look at that. But it seemed to me that it was affected by the economy and the world situation at the time. So I tried to include all of that. Another issue was that for several decades, the physics community didn't make much of what we now call public outreach. And it's understood, we're all doing public outreach all the time. But back then, public outreach was somehow considered not a scientist's role. Unfortunately, you know, that could have been done better. High energy physics community also felt they could keep everything that they had in their budget, in the Department of Energy's budget, and add a new laboratory. So creating this whole new and gigantic laboratory was an additional enormous expense that was very difficult to argue for in the Congress. There had been sniping from non-high energy physics communities, Solid State, Phil Anderson in particular, Jim Krumhansel, president of the APS. These were people who were not in favor because they didn't want high energy physics to drain their budgets. They wanted, you know, an equal share, or at least a proportionate share for their projects. And they felt that a big new project would threaten them. I think I said this, yes. Another issue that really came to light, and I think Marge and Bill played a huge role down in Texas, was trying to help with science literacy. And the SSC came into reality at a time when we all realized the public, we need to talk to the public about science for them to appreciate and understand the benefits, you know, that people don't take apart their radios anymore, and people don't. Maybe Jeffrey, where's Jeffrey? Takes apart the computers all the time. But, you know, science literacy is so important. And then finally, this is number 17, 10 plus reasons, I could go on and on. The lack of international cooperation from the start was a real problem. And by the time they realized it was a real problem, because Congress was holding the project to their word that international support would be coming to help pay for the SSC, there were awkward attempts made to build those bridges with those countries that were interested in this project, but it was too late. And there were opposing goals in this rhetoric in Congress about building a national project, a national accelerator, because in the beginning it was called the Ronald Reagan National Center for High Energy Physics. And then as they realized they needed to internationalize it, you couldn't persuade congressmen to buy into support of a program where the magnets were going to be built in another country, or the cryogenics might be coming from Russia. They wanted to, the congressmen wanted this money to help their constituents in their home districts. And so the opposing goals of a national project versus an international project. And I do think that CERN has benefited from a lot of the missteps taken in our attempt to build the SSC. And they came out, you know, and they built a smaller accelerator. And it was a controversy at the time because Americans were hoping for European support. That's a whole nother story. I just hope that when you read the book, you will see just how complicated these pioneers who were trying to build the superconducting super collider, the most powerful accelerator ever attempted, how hard they worked to make it happen, and how disappointed they were when, you know, essentially the rug was pulled out from under them, a total unfortunate situation. So let's sign some books and we'll have some celebrating. Finally, the book is finished and it's here.
There's one
You
thing I
gave away
wanted
the
to
ending.
ask you.
But,
So,
Andrea,
I mean, given that we live now in the way we do, and we're always going on about how nobody gets together, Congress, etc., don't pass and don't do anything, but on the other hand, listening to you just now, it seems that people are more in touch, there is more scientific outreach. Do you think if we were trying to do this now, it would be different, or it would be the same problem?
it's interesting.
Just wondered
I
whether
do
you...
think it would be different. I think we've learned a lot in the aftermath of the cancellation of the SSC, and I think a lot of our proponents in Washington helped us to realize, George Brown, who was congressman in California, was one of the first to say the physicists need to explain these things. They need to bring us all